A man had just been hired as the new CEO of a large high-tech corporation. And prior to stepping down into this new role and new position, he met with the previous CEO for any advice that he might give him. And so the departing CEO says to him, well, sometimes you're going to make wrong choices. You just will. You will mess up, and when that happens, I have prepared 3 envelopes for you. I left them in the top drawer of the desk. The first time it happens, open up envelope number 1. The second time you mess up, open up envelope number 2. And then the third time, open up number 3. Well, for the first few months, everything goes fine, and then the CEO makes his first mistake, and not knowing what to do, he remembers the 3 envelopes. He goes to the drawer and he opens up envelope number 1, and the message reads, "Blame me." So he does. This is the old CEO's fault. He made these mistakes. I inherited these problems. And everybody says, okay, so it works out pretty well. Things go fine for a while, and then he makes his second mistake, so he goes to the drawer and he opens up envelope number 2. This time it reads, "Blame the board." And he does. He says, it's the board's fault. The board has been a mess. I inherited these problems. They're their problems. And everybody says, okay, that makes sense. Things go fine for a while, then he makes his third mistake. He goes to the drawer and he opens up envelope number 3. And the message reads, "Prepare 3 envelopes." Prepare 3 envelopes. Now, I have been your pastor for 1 week shy of a year. And no doubt I have made my share of mistakes, but since Pastor Lynn didn't leave me 3 envelopes, I will carry on. Now seriously, that's not where that was supposed to go. But seriously, what happens when you run out of people to blame? What do you do when you have no one to blame but yourself? Well, Jesus told a story of a manager who was called into the owner's office about some allegations. And we don't know how many chances he was given, for that isn't Jesus' point. The focus of the story is on what this manager does after being fired when he must prepare 3 envelopes. It's the manager's bailout plan that becomes the emphasis of the story that at first pass, quite frankly, is rather perplexing. This parable is often entitled "The Unjust Steward." But I think it would be more appropriate to give it the title "Shrewd Dude," or something to that effect. A couple of weeks ago, we began our summer sermon series on unforgettable stories. We're looking at a sample of Jesus' parables. And I remind you that the word parable simply means to place alongside. To place alongside. It's a story that's placed alongside a principle to illustrate a truth. We might say it's an earthly story with a heavenly meaning. Now, what we must be careful of when it comes to parables is to press each detail in the parable to give it some spiritual meaning. Many preachers have gone off the deep end in their teaching of parables. I say deep end because hearers of such teaching walk away saying, wow, that was deep. I never saw that before. Perhaps you never saw it before because it isn't there. I mean, it preaches, it sounds good, but uncovering meanings for this in a parable and uncovering meanings for that in a parable while forsaking Jesus' intention for telling the story in the first place misses the use of parables altogether. Well, in the parable before us, Luke chapter 16, Jesus has a point he wants to make, and he illustrates that point with a story. It's a story about our attitude toward money and possessions. Interestingly, Jesus gave roughly 40 parables, and 1 out of 3 parables deal with money in some way. Not surprising, really, when you figure how much money is on our minds. Statistics tell us that we spend more of our waking time thinking about money more than anything else. We think about how to acquire more of it and save it, spend it, invest it, borrow it, and count it. It has been noted that by the time you reach 85 years of age, you would have spent nearly 50 years of your waking time thinking about money. Really? 50 years? Well, since it's on our minds anyway, Jesus challenges us to think rightly about it. And Jesus, the master storyteller, often filled his stories with some shocking, startling things. He does that in today's story. Well, if you're not there, turn your Bibles to Luke chapter 16. Luke chapter 16. A lot of the verses will be on the screen for you, but if you have your Bibles or your phone or whatever you use, turn to Luke chapter 16. And here we find in Luke 16 that Jesus is talking to his disciples while others are listening in. And what we have here is a good lesson from bad books. Good lesson from bad books. The story begins with, "You're fired." You're fired. Follow along as I read Luke 16, verse 1. Jesus told his disciples there was a rich man whose manager was accused of wasting possessions. Now, the manager, just so we understand this, the manager was given the responsibility to act on behalf of the absentee landowner. He would be hired for such a position because he would have been considered trustworthy. He was trusted with the full operation of this agricultural business. This hired steward manages all the land, all the crops, all the owner's assets. The owner is a rich man. The manager also is doing quite well for himself, for it's obvious that he's doing business with some very wealthy people. And apparently, in this story, someone blew the whistle on this manager who was wasting the owner's possessions. This accusation has a tone of hostility to it, but it's an accusation that sticks. And the word for wasting or squandering in some translations is the same word used for the prodigal son who threw away all his money in loose living. It's the same word. The manager here is totally irresponsible, throwing the owner's money away. Well, the rich owner doesn't waste any time, and he calls in the manager for a meeting. It's a very brief meeting. It's actually a monologue. He fires him on the spot. He says to the manager, verse 2, he says, "What is this I hear about you? Give an account of your management because you cannot be a manager any longer." Now, this accounting that is required of him, we understand this accounting that's required of him is not to keep his job, for that's a done deal. There's no debate here. He's fired. It's for the purpose of pulling together a final report. Now, I do wonder why the owner gives this irresponsible manager a little time here. I mean, if you're going to fire someone for mismanagement of your money, why would you give him any more time to do any more damage? Why allow this manager to hang around for another minute? I mean, kind of like we don't let the door hit you on the way out. You're done. He gives him some time. Well, the story really has little to do with the owner, but everything to do with the manager. The spotlight is on him. And this manager realizes that he's in trouble. He has no job. Perhaps he has no home either, since it's likely he lived right there on the owner's property. His future doesn't look very promising since he was fired for being irresponsible. I mean, that's not going to look very good on a resume. Reason for leaving last job. Fired for wasting employers' money. It's going to be hard to get another job like this. The man is in deep trouble. And when you're in deep trouble, you start talking to yourself. He says to himself, verse 3, "What shall I do now? My master is taking away my job. I'm not strong enough to dig. I'm ashamed to beg." You see, there'd be plenty of jobs available if he wanted them, but they would require manual labor, and he's used to being at a management level. He was a white-collar kind of guy, and digging for a living, well, in his estimation, that was beneath him. It's amazing, really, how some people would prefer to stay out of work with little or no money than to work at a job that just isn't them. Well, it's right here, right at this point, that this fired manager has an epiphany, a eureka moment. He says in verse 4, he's still talking to himself, he says in verse 4, "I know what I'll do so that when I lose my job here, people will welcome me into their houses. Hang on to verse 4. We're going to revisit that in a little bit. But suffice it to say for now, note the man's motivation. The man is looking out for number one only, himself. He is most concerned about himself. He's going to need some friends. And in the Jewish culture, reciprocation was huge. It was I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine mentality. And so he goes to these guys, and in essence he says, you owe me. You owe me. Follow along, I pick it up verse 5. So he called in each of one of the master's debtors. He asked the first, how much do you owe my master? 800 gallons of olive oil, he replied. And the manager told him, take your bill, sit down quickly, and make it 400. Then he goes to the second guy and asks, how much do you owe me? 1,000 bushels of wheat, he replied. He told him, well, take your bill and make it 800. Now, here's his bright idea. He contacts all the people who are in debt to the owner. These debts are outstanding, and they're waiting payment likely at harvest. He goes to each debtor one by one, and he strikes a deal with them to discount their debt big time. Likely word was not out yet that he was fired, so these debtors can only assume that the manager is acting on behalf of the owner. And so one guy owes 800 gallons of olive oil, which is estimated to be about 3 years of wages, by the way. And it's reduced to half of that amount, so it's now 400 gallons. This negotiating, did you note, is done kind of quickly, as verse 6 says. It's one of those quick sign here schemes, right? Isn't that how con artists work? Come on, sign us quickly. Don't read everything here. You don't have time. Just sign it. But why wouldn't the debtor agree to this? It cut the debt in half. He goes to the second guy. He strikes the deal with him as well, reducing that amount 20%, and he too can't sign fast enough. Now, it's worth mentioning here, just for context, for understanding of this culture, we need to understand that the commercial practices of the time. Jews were not to charge interest in loaning money to fellow Jews. So a way around this would be to build into the bill interest without showing it as interest. For example, if you borrowed $80, it was written up as $100. It didn't say $80 in principal and $20 in interest. It was just built right into it. It simply said $100. The owner and the manager were in on this together. And that's what makes this plan so brilliant. The owner, we would say, is caught between that proverbial rock and a hard place because he knew about the interest added to the bill in the first place. He can't do anything to stop this. That is, if he wants to save face and keep his own business going. He's stuck. So the manager would look at the debtors and say, you owe me. The owner looks at the manager and he says, you got me. You got me. Verse 8 gives us the twist in the story. It says, the master commended the dishonest manager because he acted shrewdly. The owner has to sit back in his chair and go, you got me on this one. Pretty clever. You're a shrewd dude. He's not commending him for previous dishonest and wasteful practices that got him fired. He's not going to get his job back. That's not the point. But he's giving him credit for at least acting shrewdly under the circumstances. The entrepreneurial owner appreciates resourcefulness. Nothing else. The owner knows an opportunist when he sees one. Now, I read about some thieves in Liverpool, England, who stole a car from outside someone's house. A few days later, they returned the car all nicely washed and cleaned. That was nice of them. On the dashboard was this little note that said, thank you for the use of your car. Why don't you and your wife go to the theater? Please use the tickets enclosed. Sure enough, there were 2 tickets next to the note to attend a production at the theater at such and such a date. Couple thought it was odd to receive 2 tickets to the theater by the thieves who borrowed their car, but were thrilled with such an expensive gift, and they went to the production at the theater. And while the couple was gone to the theater, they robbed their house. Now, talk about you got me. The couple was had, deceived, conned. It's no fun being conned. But what these thieves did was dishonest. Hear me on that. It was wrong. But in terms of resourcefulness and cleverness, it was quite good. You can tell by your response. It was quite clever. In the same way, the owner here is applauding the manager's shrewdness. We might get that. We can kind of understand why a corrupt owner would commend this guy. What is troubling about this story is that Jesus commends this. The end of verse 8. The end of verse 8. Notice end of verse 8. Where Jesus says, "For the people of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light." Jesus tells a story where the hero is cooking the books, or we might say doing a little creative accounting. He's a conniving, dishonest, irresponsible manager. Jesus is not commending any of that. He isn't even saying the ends justify the means. That isn't Jesus' point. That isn't the lesson. So what is? What's the lesson? Well, we kind of need to take a step back from the story, like standing back from a magnificent painting to see what we miss up close. And that leads to now and then. Now and then. The lesson for us starts to come into focus as we observe the distinction that Jesus makes here in verse 8. We find in the punchline 2 groups of people. Again, verse 8. Jesus says, end of verse 8, the people of this world, group number 1, are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light, group number 2. We have the people of this world and we have the people of this light. The people of this world are not only in this world, but of this world. They have no thought of eternity. Everything for them happens only between birth and death. They are described in Ephesians 2 as without hope and without God in this world. They live for now. They are all about now. They have a YOLO mindset. You only live once. Now the other group is the people of the light. They're in the world, but not of it. Their citizenship is in heaven. They're only passing through this world, but their home is in heaven. They live for then. So we have the now and the then. Now, what is of help here, and to understand what this is all about, is what this man is being commended for by Jesus. What is he being commended for? His shrewdness. His shrewdness. Now, the word shrewd means acting advantageously. Acting advantageously. The manager worked the situation in such a way that put him in a good position for a secure future. The man was thinking ahead for his own needs to be met. And when Jesus says at the end of verse 8, the people of this world and dealing with their own kind are more shrewd in dealing with their own kind than are the people of the light. It's a lesson from the lesser to the greater, which was a very common method of teaching used in that day. And Jesus is saying that those who are focused on the now are far more creative and shrewd when it comes time to get a return on their investment. Those focused on the now are better at using their resources for their own gain than those who say the issues of life are eternal in significance. And we see that at work all the time in the world. How people just take advantage of the situation in order to make money for themselves, right? You see some event all of a sudden pops up in your area, and then everybody's home and yard becomes a parking garage. Park here for $5. And everyone does it, and they make some money on the deal. People do it all the time. We see people of this world take advantage of opportunities to make money, and in some cases, to absurdity. For instance, true story. 20-year-old Andrew Fisher auctioned off the empty space on his forehead for advertisement to the highest bidder on eBay. Now, you say that's absurd, but the winning company bid $37,375 for Fisher to display their logo on his forehead for 30 days. We might say he's using his head. Sorry. Some of you might want to try this. You have no, forget it. The people of this world are experts. They're experts at gaining opportunities for themselves. And frankly, the world does circles around us, the people of light, in the area of creativity, ingenuity, and shrewdness. The world draws up these clever strategies. Businesses develop ingenious plans for reaching the globe with their product line. The arts and the media pull out all the stops with their creativity, and all for what? For now. Dealing with their own kind and securing the better future, the best future on earth for themselves. Now, I'm not suggesting for a moment we must dazzle and entertain for success, but really, we should be the most ingenious, creative group around. We serve an unlimited God, drawing upon his unlimited resources, and yet we do the same thing, different verse, and we wonder why the unbelieving world is not interested and our Christian kids are bored with it all. John Calvin put it this way. He said, ungodly and worldly men are more industrious and skillful in conducting the affairs of this fading life than the children of God are careful to make eternal life the subject of their study. If a worldly, evil, dishonest manager is shrewd in the use of money that he has access to, how about us who know the Lord? If a conniving, crafty, self-centered, shrewd guy does what he needs to do with the resources he has available to him to make his own life a little easier in the future, then how much more should we who have eternal future use our resources and plan for that? That's the point Jesus wants to drive home. What's the takeaway? What's the takeaway? It's not complicated. The takeaway is live now in light of then. Live now in light of then. Verse 9, Jesus says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves so that when it is gone, you will be welcomed into eternal dwellings. What did this manager do? He used what he had to secure his future on earth. This shrewd dude was opportunistic. He used earthly strategies and resources for earthly gain. He was thinking only about the now, the temporary, this earthly life. What are we to do? Why are we to give? Why are we to generously give away our resources so that we can get something back now? Is that what Jesus puts out there? No, Scripture may speak to that in other places, but right here, he speaks of the investment you are making for all of eternity in people's lives. Now, sometimes the evangelical pitch to give goes something like this. If you give 10%, God will give you much more in return now. Maybe. From a business practical sense, who wouldn't sign on for that? If I drop $50 in the plate today, God's going to give me $100 back. Pretty good payback. Certainly better than any bank or CD or stock. Now, I'm not saying God won't do that. I'm not saying when you give, you get nothing in return monetarily in this life, but everything in this passage here is about what? The then. Jesus is talking about eternity. Jesus says, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it is gone, you be welcomed into eternal dwellings. He is not saying by this, go buy your friends or buy your kids love. He's not saying that. He's not suggesting we manipulate others for the making of friends so that we can get what we want. Not saying that. This isn't a money talks kind of lesson. Believer, we know when we pass from this life to the next, there's going to be one big reunion with loved ones. I mean, that's going to be something. But do you realize, I think you do, that there will also be those waiting on heaven's edge to greet you with a bear hug. Sorry, non-huggers. It's my take on it. No chapter and verse on that one. But there will be people greeting you. That's here. There'll be people greeting you because of your dollars given to some ministry or missionary that reached their soul for Jesus Christ. There will be people perhaps you have never met before that had opportunity to hear and respond to the gospel because of your gifts, because of your prayers, because of your partnering with someone who told them about Christ. Welcomed into eternal dwellings, it says here. By whom? By people you have invested in now, who will welcome you then for spending time pouring into their lives. That's who's going to welcome you. So what are we investing in? Invest in people. Invest in people. Invest in the gospel. Make friends for eternity. We're all not going to have the same welcome committee. Are you using your worldly possessions for building friendships that will last for eternity? Am I? Is that how we think about our money and resources? Did God give you the abilities you have right now just for the now? Just so you can get a paycheck? Just so that you can retire someday? Is that all we're shooting for? If so, we're not shooting high enough, not if we're people of the light. People of the light who live for eternity ought to have a better investment strategy than those who live for today only. We ought to be so preoccupied with investment of the now for the then. We ought to be super generous, a generosity that far exceeds the people of this world, because we know that every investment made for eternity, God will do right by us when He welcomes us into heaven, when we get to that finish line. Live now in light of then. Let's get shrewd for Jesus' sake, for the kingdom's sake. Now, the beautiful thing about this principle, live now in light of then, is that we all can live it out right where we are today. Look at Jesus' finishing touches on his application in verse 10. He's not done yet. That means I'm not done yet. Verse 10, Jesus says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And who is ever dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. There's some people who want to skip past the little things and get on with the big things. Not Albert Lexie. He was a shoe shine man. For the last 30 years, Albert has set up shop in Pittsburgh's Children's Hospital. He knocked the dirt off of other people's shoes. He buffs, he polishes, and he charges a mere $5 for his labor. That's it. Often a satisfied customer will leave a tip. Most give an extra $1, some give $2. People just don't really care today about the condition of their shoes like they used to. Albert's a relic left over from another era, a different world. But when Albert has shined his last shoe and put away his shoe shine kit for good, he will not be forgotten at the Pittsburgh Children's Hospital. Albert will leave behind a legacy. Since the day he shined his first pair of shoes there 30 years ago, Albert has donated more than a third of his earnings to the Children's Hospital Free Care Fund, which helps parents who can't afford to pay for their sick children's medical costs. In addition, Albert also has given the hospital every tip he's ever received. Every single tip. But Albert's just a shoe shine man. I mean, how much could there really be to give? Well, according to the hospital administration, he gave just over $200,000. It's a seemingly impossible number. 200 grand is what professional athletes give, not a shoe shine man. And yet, that's the correct number. See, even small amounts given faithfully add up to a powerful legacy. Wherever you are, you can live in light of eternity. Live now in light of eternity. See, what determines our faithfulness? Not circumstances, not amount. It's about our character. It's about integrity. It's about where we're investing. If your desire is to invest in eternity, you will do it. If you don't desire to invest in eternity, you won't do it. No change in circumstances or amount will ever alter that. Some say, if I had $1 million, I would give to this and I would give to that. You might think that when you land that big job or you make it to a higher level in your sport or exposure or education that you will practice faithfulness at that point. Listen, if you struggle with faithfulness and following through right now on something or figure it isn't a big deal and blowing off what you said you would do, or you can't be trusted to carry out that little responsibility, listen, don't think that all of a sudden when you land that big job, or you get that huge break, or you're given more responsibility, that you will be instantly faithful. How we handle even the small things reveals our character, who we are right now. Like the shoe shine guy. Are we using what we have been given now for then? What are you doing with the resources God has given you, that He's given me? What kind of welcoming committee are we going to have when we get to the other side? When all our stuff is gone and the race is finished, will we be commended by our owner? 2 Kentucky farmers owned racing stables, and over time they developed a strong rivalry between them. One spring, each of them entered a horse in a local steeplechase. Thinking that a professional rider might help him outdo the other, one of the farmers hired an extremely proficient jockey. The two horses were neck to neck with a large lead over the rest of the pack at the last turn, but suddenly both horses fell, unseating both riders. The professional jockey remounted quickly, and he rode on to win the race. Returning triumphantly to the paddock, the jockey noticed that the farmer who hired him was fuming with anger. "What's the matter?" the jockey asked. "I won, didn't I?" "Oh yeah," roared the farmer, "you won all right, but you crossed the finish line on the wrong horse." We may figure we're running a good race. Let's make sure we're on the correct horse. Because when we cross that finish line, we won't have anyone to blame. Are we living for now, or are we living for then? Let's be shrewd in the time we have now to live in light of the then. Let's be opportunistic for God's glory. As Martin Luther loved to say, there are 2 days in my calendar, this day and that day. Let's continue to live this day for that day.